Hello, this is Let's Talk About Myths, baby, and I am your host, Liv, here today with a conversation about everyone's favorite Roman, our boy Ovid. You all know that Ovid's Metamorphoses is one of the only texts from Rome that I actually care about. Sorry, but not actually sorry. So when I was approached by Freddie Kimpton to talk time in Metamorphoses, obviously I was incredibly keen. So Freddie is a PhD student at Exeter, doing his PhD in, well, time in Ovid's Metamorphoses. I know how you all ask me questions about time and chronology constantly, and I do not blame you. And normally you just say, or I just say, try not to understand it. But in Ovid's Metamorphoses, it's a little bit easier, and thankfully there's an expert to help us. So today we talked about just that. And of course, we referenced so many of the incredible moments that are in this text. Gods, it's fun. We did record this a while back, as you might gather, around when I had the incredible conversation with Stephanie McCarter, who talked about her new translation of this exact text. Remember, that is the translation you want if you want to read this book. But this chat was so fascinating. I just love learning literally everything possible about all the varied things that Ovid was doing with his work. It's just, well, it's the best. We all know it, so let's get right into it. Conversations, chronology and mythology don't mix, unless they do. Time in Ovid's Metamorphoses with Freddie Kimpton. To preface, I've been sort of unintentionally deep into Ovid's Metamorphoses lately, so this came at the perfect time. I will have a few different episodes coming out in various relation to that work, so it was great to have this. But I'm really curious about, so you are looking at specifically time in Ovid's Metamorphoses?
Yeah, so I mean the motivation behind it is, I guess there's a body of scholarship on the poem that sort of really struggles, maybe that's the wrong word, but hasn't reached a consensus in terms of sort of the way in which the episodes fit together and the way in which the poem manages to get from the creation of the world to sort of Ovid's own period, and how the mechanics of how that actually happens, basically. So based on sort of previous research I did on Ovid's Fasti, which is another poem which is to do with the Roman calendar, I sort of saw an opportunity here to sort of look at this issue, time, sort of more generally in the poem, and see if I could sort of, maybe come up with an interpretation that maybe was more... moved the scholarship forward or something like that, or that had something useful to say about the subject. And also, as well as talking about time in the Metamorphoses, managed to link the Metamorphoses with the Fasti, which is this other poem which is about time, or the way time is organized in the Roman world. These two poems were written about the same period of Ovid's career, so there's lots of connections between the two, so it's sort of unpicking those threads really, and coming up with something innovative.
Interesting, yeah. So when it comes to Metamorphoses, I mean, it's an interesting thing to think about, because like you're saying, it begins with the creation of the world and ends with Ovid's time period. But of course, it's almost explicitly mythological until it's reaching towards Ovid's time period, and then it's kind of a mythological interpretation of his time period. So how do you kind of navigate the transition into whatever level of reality that you want to call, the end sections?
Well, that's a really tricky question, actually. So I guess there are two things to say about that. First of all, I think there's a feeling that myth and in and of itself sort of flattens time in a sense. So when you're in what one might consider to be a mythological period, it's very difficult to sort of organize events in a sequence, because it's sort of time and space becomes a bit blurred. You're not sure what happens when, really, in what we conceive of as myth. And the second thing is that there is a sort of consensus that the poem does move from an age of gods to one of heroes, and then on to sort of, I guess, the time of datable history. Although, when that actually happens in the poem is really, really difficult. And as you say, I think those episodes that are historical are treated in a way that maybe we wouldn't consider to be historical now, for instance. So to take an example, the arrival of Asclepius in Rome, which happens in book 15, it's one of the last episodes, and that's datable to the 220s, something like that. Or it might actually, okay, let's start again with that one. I think it might be a bit earlier than that, around 290, something like that. But that's a datable event historically. But the way it's described in terms of the statue sort of being transported to the ship, and then it turns into a snake, and it travels on the ship as a snake, it's obviously sort of fantastical. So those divisions between what's historical and what's mythological are quite blurred in the poem, I think, and that's part of the issue that people face, because what people want is to have an established chronological structure, and that's a really difficult thing to establish in the poem, I think. So where I'm sort of what I'm looking at, I would say, is, I guess, trying to find some sort of structure there, or some sort of structure of time system that works for the poem, that isn't necessarily linear or cyclical. But also, I think the important thing is to look at maybe how within the internal world of the Metamorphoses, the actors in that world, the divine actors and the human actors, how they experience time, and what it means for them, really. So it's looking at structure, and it's also looking at experience, really, how people respond to it, which I think is actually probably, in my view, the most interesting part, because that's where a lot of the tension in the poem resides, in terms of the way they understand their own temporality.
Well, I'd love to hear examples of that, because that sounds really interesting, particularly with the characters within the poem itself.
Well, I can give you an example. So say in book 3 of the Metamorphoses, we have a story that relates to the Theban king Pentheus, for instance. Now, he is the son of Echion, who was one of the original Thebans who grew out of the serpent's teeth when Cadmus founded the city.
The nephew of Cadmus also. He's the son of Cadmus's own daughter as well.
That's right. Mm-hmm. The genealogy there is really strong. Mm-hmm. So that's how he understands himself, I think. If you look at the way he interprets his own identity and the identity of the people who belong to that city, he sees them as part of a line that extends back to that foundational moment. And then he is faced with this incomer who happens to be also from Thebes, but is an incomer, which is, who is Bacchus, really. And his understanding of temporality is very different, or the way that it's expressed through his followers. In a sense, they enjoy that moment that seems to last forever, the frenzied moment where they lose sense of themselves and their own identity, and it almost feels as if it could last forever, except it doesn't. But they lose sense of their own place in time, and also place in terms of their own physical location. So you have two very different conceptions of time in that sense. Bacchus and Pentheus basically have two very different conceptions of time. And the drama, I think, in that story resides in when those conceptions of time, those understandings of their own temporality sort of come together and they clash, for instance. So when Pentheus finds that Thebans are sort of going over to Bacchus and sort of becoming part of his entourage and behaving in that way, he appeals to them by recalling that foundational moment, by talking to them about their own sense of identity as Thebans that go back to this moment when the city was founded. And then at the end, when he is dismembered, he's dismembered by his own family. So in a sense, it's that idea of one's genealogy, one's family line, it ends up destroying him. But that's how he sees himself. That's why that moment is so destructive, because he sees himself as part of a long family line that goes back all the way back to Cadmus. And yet, in the end, Bacchus engineers it so that his own family is the one who destroys him. And I think, if I remember rightly, there's a simile right at the end there which talks about the leaves being shaken on a tree, and that tree, obviously, you can see that as representative of a family tree, a family line, and you can see Bacchus as being this sort of force, this storm that then sort of just drives through. So that particular story has got really interesting temporal aspects to it, and it's those temporal aspects, I think, that help shape the conflict that comes that exists in that story. If that makes sense. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's one of my favorite stories too, mostly because of Euripides, but Ovid's version is great too. It's interesting. I just read the first half of book 3 yesterday, so I'm like, oh, I missed the second half. It would have been really great if I had gotten through to that. But that's it's interesting, and that's such a fascinating family line broadly. They're one of my favorites to look at, not least because I just enjoy Cadmus and Harmonia's story, but then to look at, I think their story, and I think this is probably just as true in Ovid. Obviously, I deal mostly in Greek myth, but their story is one of the most conceptual in terms of you can actually watch the family tree go down, the rungs, the branches of the tree, I should say, in a way that there's not a lot of families where you can kind of watch the generations happen. And of course, in their case, they're also a particularly cursed line of generations. But I wonder if time comes into their story even more, just because you can trace their genealogical line in a way that is slightly unique in the rest of the work.
No, absolutely. And I think that's where we jump back from experience back onto structure. In a sense, that genealogy gives that sequence of stories a really strong structure that the reader can understand, because the reader can place each individual in a sort of pattern, as it were. And then you have the added effect of how that's then experienced as well. There's a really interesting moment in book 3 where Ovid, in his guise as the poet narrator, sort of jumps in and he tells Cadmus, he says, after the foundation of the city, and then Cadmus is established and he has children and grandchildren, and he says, watch out, don't feel that you're fortunate. No one is ever fortunate until the day they die. And it's a lovely it's an extended transitional moment, an apostrophe, and it moves the story on from Cadmus himself to the next of those stories, which is Actaeon, and obviously the devastating outcome for that individual at the hands of Diana. So there is a heightened awareness throughout, I think, that book, of the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle that go to make that particular family.
Mm-hmm. Now I'm going to forget whether I'm right in remembering this or not. But is Actaeon a direct grandchild of Cadmus, or is he further down the line? Do you know? It's fine if you don't know.
Off the top of my head, I can't answer that question
No,
without
fair.
looking at the book. I'm trying to think where he fits in exactly. I'd need to look that up.
I'm just looking
I
very
can do
quickly
that.
because it's fine. I have it on here too. I was curious because he is he is the son of Autonui. Just because
yes, he is.
Yeah, I had forgotten whether there was another line in there, and if there was, that was interesting. But either way, I mean,
and that's true actually, because so I haven't looked at book 3 for a while. I've been sort of looking at other books, but going back to the Pentheus story, Autonui is one of the individuals who is part of that sort of mass of people who tear Pentheus apart. And I think, if I remember rightly, again, that Pentheus actually recalls the story of Actaeon. At that moment, he sort of an appeal to say, look what happened to Actaeon, and this is now happening to me. And so those genealogical threads in that poem, in that particular sequence of stories are so strong. They really are. And it's interesting to try and unpick them, really.
Yeah, you sort of inadvertently picked the one family line that I'm like incredibly familiar with, but they are fascinating. Yeah, well, and because and this is possibly going beyond Ovid, but they are a ridiculously cursed family line, but pretty explicitly Cadmus and Harmonia are not, in a really interesting way. So they kind of like found this dynasty, and then all of their children are just like endlessly cursed. We have Semele, who dies at the hands of Zeus while becoming the mother to Bacchus. And then, his other daughters are Autonui, Ino, and Nagawe, who all take part in ripping Pentheus to shreds before their own children or after their own children have had these other curses inflicted upon them. And so I'm not as familiar with how Ovid handles it. It just happens that I read, like I said, the first half of book 3 yesterday. But otherwise, it's just their line is so interesting broadly because it provides so many stories that became really large parts of Greek myth, while also having this sort of tangled idea of what is a family curse. Their curse is just very different from the much more explicit family curses, say, of like, the Atreides or anything. All to say, I have a lot of obsession with Cadmus and his family line. But is there any other, notes or sections that stand out in terms of what you're looking at when it comes to time? Like perhaps maybe ones that aren't so genealogically linked. Like I'm just interested in how you're looking at this concept more broadly.
So I think in terms of, let's go back to in terms of structure. What sort of structure can we apply to the poem? So in book 15, Pythagoras talks about time. There's a speech by the Samian philosopher Pythagoras, and he talks about time in that, and he likens it to a river, which goes back to sort of fragments from Heraclitus, which also sort of talk about change and the river image. And so time in Pythagoras' view is inexorably linked with change, and change is obviously the fundamental dynamic of the poem. You have sort of change in nature, that sort of universal flux that seems to be, that they talk about in the opening creation of the world, and also change as these sort of miraculous events that happen, that people turn into horses and plants and rocks and what have you. And so it's sort of time, more or less, the way Pythagoras describes it is time more or less as we see it. So we see it sort of in terms of time flowing. So like a river, time flowing, the forward motion of time. When we measure time in terms of minutes, days, hours, years. It goes forward, and that's a process that we feel powerless to stop. And that's a very human way of looking at time. And also, when Pythagoras talks, he talks about the waves hitting the shore, which is maybe a different reference to time in the sense of past, present, and future, which is another pillar in terms of the way that we as humans understand time. And so what I've been trying to do is look at that and see whether that's sort of programmatic for the poem as a whole. Is that something that works for the poem? I mean, it does relate to this fundamental dynamic of change. And also this river captures that sense that you have at the beginning, that you're talking about a poem that is continuous, a continuous thread from the beginning, the creation of the world, to Ovid's own period. So something that's quite linear. But then obviously when you look at the poem and you think, is this really linear? It just starts collapsing all the time, because the way that Ovid transitions from story to story changes. Sometimes there's a cause and effect transition. Sometimes it's a journey, or a divine journey. Some god flies through the air and 5 lines later they're somewhere completely different. Sometimes there's something simultaneous going on, for instance, a meeting of people, but someone can't make it because they're elsewhere because something terrible has happened to them. So you feel as if sort of you establish a thread and then that thread sort of ends or it's cut off, and then you have to start again and you have to build another set of stories that carry on that way. And so maybe that idea of something that's linear, or something that's linear and has cycles in it, because at the beginning of the story there's lots of these cycles of creation and destruction, maybe isn't necessarily enough, and you need to look at other aspects of the poem. And then there's this other section at the end, which involves a conversation between Jupiter and Venus, and talks about that in the dwellings of the Fates there are these tablets that have everything written down on them, all the events that have ever happened, that will ever happen, that are taking place right now. And so maybe you should look at it as, in that sense, you should look at it maybe that the structure of time in the poem, that all events exist. They don't come into being and they don't come out of being. They exist all the time, and people just happen upon them, which is a major facet of the way people understand time and space in the 20th century and the 21st century. And then the poem starts to make more sense, because you see that divinities or gods, when they travel, they can jump about. They don't necessarily have to move forward in time. They can move back in time. They can just move to other locations at other moments in time. And then it provides a poem with more flexibility, maybe, and that's maybe how the poem works better in terms of understanding how each of the events relates to one another. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, because I can explain it again. But yeah, so I think what you have with the poem doesn't the poem's like, I think it's like myth in general. It doesn't necessarily give you easy answers. So what it does, it gives you a range of options, and then it's up to the reader, really, I think, to sort of interpret that the way they want. And make judgments. When the Metamorphoses, which is in many respects quite a complicated poem ethically, presents a story, there's enough space there's enough bandwidth for the reader to make their own judgments, basically, I think. And I think it's the same with time, really. It offers you it suggests a variety of structures, and then you, as the reader, determine which one you think applies best to the poem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. I can't help thinking too of the intention, the more obvious intention of Ovid in this work. The telling of all of these transformations and pulling so many of them from Greek myth, but also possibly or we're not sure, but or inventing a lot of them as well, since it seems like a lot of them are sort of without background, and then also incorporating time into that is interesting, just because from what my perspective, looking at them, he so often kind of slots in these transformations into different areas and different stories, seemingly to sort of fill the poem with as many transformations as he possibly can, and then but the idea of then if he's also playing with time or working off of any kind of linear structure, whether or not we can piece it together is sort of just an interesting thing to think about as well. I think of it so much as the myth themselves, and I was recently speaking about the Medea section and the way that he sort of, when she's flying over the Greek world in her chariot, he seems to kind of slot in all these other references to just these brief stories of transformation, that have seemingly happened like in either the past or the recent past. And sort of now this isn't forming into any kind of question. I'm just sort of thinking about that now in reference to time itself, and kind of whether he had any of that in mind while he's also slotting in all of these varied transformations. It's just an interesting thing to think about.
I think when you first read the Metamorphoses, you get the sense of you get an impression of a poet who likes to show his talent and his skill, basically.
Yeah.
So that Medea journey is one where his virtuosity, the ability he has to shoehorn all these stories in. But I think taking that a bit further, actually, I think one of the important things that I feel, if you have a poem that's really complex in terms of its chronological structure, the Ovid, the poet narrator, becomes a really important figure in that, because he's the unifying thread that helps the reader get from A to B, essentially from the beginning to the end. And it means that he is a really important figure in terms of the structure of the poem. So it says, so Ovid is a really important figure in terms of the structure of the poem. And what he does, I think, is he offers you windows into stories that he then doesn't describe, or he doesn't describe at length.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you see the Metamorphoses maybe as something that is sort of like a four-dimensional structure, with space and time working in concert, and then you then maybe think, well, that might be like a labyrinth with all these different corridors, intersecting, diverging, running parallel, so on and so forth. A bit like Daedalus's labyrinth in Book 8, I think. Which is compared to a river, the river Meander, which a river that's notoriously deceptive. If you see the Metamorphoses as a type of labyrinth, then he's sort of taking you down various corridors, and then sometimes he shows you another corridor and he says, well, do you know what? That's really interesting, that one, but I'm not going to take you down that one, because we're going to go down this way. And then we're going to go here. And then we're going to go back, and that's how I think the poem works. Actually, I think he navigates you. He's the navigation system that gets you from the beginning to the end. And it's quite interesting that Daedalus reference, actually, because one of the things that passage in Book 8 says, that Daedalus made that the labyrinth was so complex that Daedalus could barely make his way back to the entrance, really. Mm-hmm. And I think you get a sense of that in the poem, really. Choices, as what we were talking about before, choices. He offers you, choices. You can go down this way, you can go down that way, but now we're going to go this way. And, there's a really interesting corridor there, but no, we're not really going to see that. We're going to go down that way. That's how I see it working, really. I think he's a really, his presence is always there, even though he only sort of pops up occasionally, sort of from under the water. You feel his presence always there, just a guiding hand.
Yeah. I mean, I think that description sounds exactly like those moments of Medea flying over, because that's exactly what he's excuse me, that's exactly what he's doing. Is, she's just looking down and she sees, like, oh yeah, there was that time that this guy got transformed, like, it was pretty cool, I'm not gonna tell you anything more. There's so many moments like that where we just get these like little hints of a story, but we're not actually told the story. And from my perspective, as somebody who's looking into the mythology and typically the Greek origins of the mythology, those ones were particularly fascinating for me, because I'm searching afterwards to see what kind of sourcing Ovid might have been working off of, if we have it. And for the most part, none of those actually existed in surviving Greek sources. They seem to almost be inventions of his, and of course we can't know that for sure, but if they were inventions of his, I think that makes it even more interesting, because like you say, like, he is really explicitly kind of teasing at these ideas without following up on them. And if he was just pulling something from a Greek myth, it really has a different connotation than the idea that he is like creating a story that he is then not telling intentionally, kind of just suggesting this idea of a transformation without even diving in, and one that is entirely his own invention. Is it sort of, just a different level of kind of watching what he is doing in the poem, which, to go on another vague tangent, but that's one of the things that I find so interesting about Ovid's Metamorphoses, as somebody who is always looking into the Greek myth, is the difference of his, in that he is so intentionally writing it. He's sitting down to write a poem in a way that, the Greek sources are typically not. And that alone is something I like to think about when it comes to Ovid. So then adding in all these pieces on, what is he playing with in time? What is he playing with in terms of hinting at these stories and not actually following through? And, kind of where is he going? Why is he doing it all? It's, again, not leading to a question, but a fascinating thought experiment. And I just like to think about how Ovid was writing.
I mean, the other thing he does that I think is really important is that he does dwell on those metamorphoses, those transformations, in a way that, as far as I understand it, in the Greek tradition, they didn't really. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you look at some of those transformations, it's just, he describes it step by step, actually. Mm-hmm. And I'm trying to think of one. Let me think of Okiroe in book 2, for instance, when she transforms into a horse mid-speech. That is step by step dismantling. What he describes is a step-by-step dismantling of her identity and her personality and her ability to speak. He is, and it's quite brutal, actually, in a way. I think one of the really hard things about the Metamorphoses is to determine the tonal quality of the poem, really. And I think if you think, this is a guy, Ovid's a guy who's a bit jokey, he's a bit funny, detached, ironic, playful, then it becomes a really difficult poem, because what he describes episodes of extreme violence and of extreme suffering. And if you think that he's always jokey and always playful, then that becomes a problem, really, for that poem, I think. I wouldn't say that's the case, but that is an argument, and it's a very and you can make that argument very persuasively, in fact. So I think going back to Okiroe, there is this sort of dismantling of that person's identity that is brutal, and I think it lays bare the suffering that's experienced through some of these transformations. Really, he is a poet who is really interested or returns to the theme of the silencing of victims. It's really present in the Metamorphoses. It's really, really present in the Fasti as well. Victims often, the victims of really malevolent divinities, who, basically their speech is shut down. They can no longer speak.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, one of the most brutal stories, I think, in the Metamorphoses is the one with Tyreus, Philomela,
Mm-hmm.
and Procne, which is a really, really, really ghastly episode.
I mean, that's got to be the most violent story in all of Greek myth, let alone
Absolutely,
Ovid. Yeah.
absolutely, and he
Mm-hmm.
dwells on that story,
Mm-hmm.
and he goes back to it as well in the Fasti. It's a story that obviously resonates with him. And it's a really, really brutal story, and that is all about silencing and and then trying to communicate, and then these cycles of violence that occur. By the time you get to the transformations, you're just relieved because it's just piling violence on violence on violence. So, how do you deal with that story from a tonal point of view? It's a really tricky one. I do believe that the poem gives you the space to sort of really feel emotionally for the victims of
Mm-hmm.
those transformations.
Mm-hmm.
Although it has been argued in the past that that space doesn't exist.
I agree with you completely. I mean, I have always come at Ovid as one of the few ancient sources who seems actually really interested in suffering, particularly the suffering of women at the hands of gods and men broadly. That's one of my favorite things about reading Ovid, is that in a way that very few other sources do, he actually wants to look at those effects, the silencing, the dismantling, like you're saying, the dismantling of people's entire being as a human. They're everything about them is taken apart as they're transformed into either an animal or a tree, or something that just completely loses all of their sense of being and humanity. um my most recent conversation, which hasn't actually come out on the podcast yet, but I was speaking with Stephanie McCarter, whose new translation of Metamorphoses is coming out next week.
I'm so
And
excited.
me too. It's sitting right here. It's freaking gorgeous. It's yeah. She and I spoke on this show, which is why this conversation has come at a great time. Where it's like I'm just living in Metamorphoses right now. But speaking with Stephanie was so fascinating because, I mean, not only am I getting an insight into somebody who's just been like working through Ovid for so long to translate it, but she's coming at it with a kind of feminist lens of, just looking at it in terms of equality broadly, right? That true definition of feminism, and looking at what choices have been made in the past in terms of the characters. And I think when it comes to identity and silencing these people, that's particularly valid because so often a translation really removes the agency of particularly women, in a way that like is not true to Ovid. Like I think he is interested in how these people are suffering and why. And I think that's really obvious in certain stories too, where he's clearly pulling from a traditional Greek source and then he's changing it, turning it on its head. I think the one that's most obvious to me is Medusa, where he takes this really traditional story and he alters it in a way that makes it almost unrecognizable from the Greek, but to me shows that he is actually interested in examining Medusa as a person, as a character, and giving her this background and this history and this like empathy, this like feeling that she was a real person harmed by gods. And I mean, I think there's excuse me, I think there's a lot of cases like that in the story, in Metamorphoses broadly. Hers is just, I think, the most obviously shifted from the original sourcing, but it's just fascinating to me broadly. I definitely think that he is interested in what these people were experiencing, and that is also why he really amps up the transformation. He takes something that was a transformation perhaps in a Greek source, and he's like, let me tell you exactly the details of how that would happen and how the person would feel and what it is to have your identity removed in this way.
I think that's a really important point, and I think it's really important. I'm very excited by that translation. Really excited. I think it's really important not to sugarcoat the violence, to be honest, and be honest about it, and have that discussion. About what relevance does this poem have? In the 21st century, a poem. Because Ovid, I guess, has traditionally been seen. I mean, he still is in so much sort of critical material. He's as a playful poet, as someone who likes, overly fond of his own virtuosity. For instance, there's still that lingering argument there, I think, which probably stems, I guess, from his early poetry, really. But I think I do believe in this poem that he really is interested in those things that you talk about. And I think in terms of my own subject, I think the temporality, the time aspects of those transformations are really interesting, because when you do transform from a human to an animal, or a plant or a rock, your own temporality is fundamentally changed, essentially. So we have the way we experience time is different from the way that say animals experience time. We don't have that consciousness. We do have they don't have the consciousness that we do have, the awareness of it, I think. And temporality is so important to ourselves. We feel in the present moment all the time. We're always in that present moment, but we can remember the past, maybe not perfectly, but we can remember the past, but we don't have that same ability for the future. We can anticipate the future. We can expect things that might happen. We can imagine things that we want to happen. We don't have precognition in the way that we understand what goes on in the past. For instance, I can tell you a question that was asked by a student in a seminar that I gave 2 weeks ago, but I can't tell you the question that the same student might ask me in a seminar 2 weeks time. So there's a fundamental difference there, but we feel it all the time. We feel this presence, our own temporality. So when these individuals in the poem, those transformations happen, then it's their identity, their understanding of time and space, everything changes. And I think he captures that really brilliantly, to be honest.
I do as well,
in those descriptions.
I'm always fascinated by the people who have these sort of varied interpretations of Ovid. Like you're saying, that as a playful poet, or I hear a lot of people who suggest that he explicitly hated women. Like, that's probably not the best term, but like that's the idea people seem to have, is this idea that like he was like anti-woman. And from my own perspective, like I speak a lot about women in myth and feminism broadly, but to me, he is one of the kindest poets to women, because he might be telling a lot of tragic stories about them, but he is interested in their experiences during those tragedies. And I think that's connects back to what you're saying about this change in how we conceive time during a transformation. And it led me to think too of, it's one thing to be transformed into an animal and lose your sense of time in that respect. And in the more literal, your lifespan is typically going to be shortened, let alone that you lose that concept. But then I think about the people who are transformed into inanimate objects, or more specifically, something like a tree. Like, obviously we can't imagine that they necessarily have the thought processes or any consciousness as a tree, but the idea of being transformed into a tree is not only this loss of temporality, but also like a really extreme extension of one's lifespan in a way that I think is interesting to think about. Like, you're giving them a kind of immortality while also taking away everything that makes them able to conceive of mortality.
And these transformations, that in so many of them, there's still a residue of that humanity still there, to be honest, which makes it so. That's what gives it gives it its pathos, really, in a sense. That the individual is still aware, is still aware in their new form that something has happened to them, something horrific has happened to them. I mean, I'm trying to think, actually, when you spoke just then, I immediately thought of Mirror in book 10, 11, and she's transformed into a tree and then has to give birth to Adonis.
Yeah,
which is a painful experience. Is an incredibly painful experience at the best of times as a human. So so that suffering is really, really there. What I would say, I think, going back to your earlier point, I think in the end, maybe trying to determine the intentions of Ovid or any poet who has been dead for 2,000 years might be a bit of a cul-de-sac in the end. So I think what we have are the words. And I think the words are sufficient as I said before, they allow enough space for us to come up with different interpretations, our own interpretations. So in a sense, when you establish the meaning of an episode or what it means to you, rather than trying to think, I'm going to work out here what Ovid intended, that's a more dynamic process of finding the meaning through the act of reading. And you'll read an episode, I'll read an episode, and we come away with different things from that episode, and that's all okay, I think. And then that allows us to escape from what I think sometimes is a really sterile argument about the person who was Ovid. What was he trying to guess from these words, what he was like as a person and what he intended, and the tone of the poem. And I think that's quite a good strategy to sort of take these sorts of poems forwards. I mean, with Ovid as well, I mean, the classic case with him is his exile poetry, and then this sort of slightly, this sort of argument that has persisted over time that was an invention of his, that it was a complete fabrication, and that he wasn't exiled, he just wrote this stuff, and it was all, I don't know, a game, or it was just all invented, basically. And you get that a lot with, I think, this particular author. There is a feeling that he's a certain type of person, and then all of his poetry is often sort of shoehorned into that understanding of what he's like, really.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of that's true, and it's also sort of fun often to theorize and consider like what these people could have been like. Personally, I'm just interested in it because we get these like non-definitive but fascinating looks into the ancient world by considering what the mindset could have been, even if we'll never know for certain. But it is interesting to look at sort of everything and come up with ideas.
Well, they do say never meet your heroes.
Exactly.
So,
good, we'll never know.
So maybe if you met Ovid, the 20-year-old, you wouldn't be necessarily hugely impressed with him as a person. But then, a 20-year-old and a 50-year-old are very different people, aren't they? So,
yeah, I was going to make a joke about, rarely being particularly impressed by 20-year-olds, but I think I have too many 20-year-old listeners for that. Yeah, it's interesting to just think of these as real people. I think for me, I hold on to the idea of considering someone like Ovid in terms of a real person, but that's primarily because I typically work with sources that weren't real people, Hesiod and Homer, and these ideas of people, these concepts, but that were almost certainly not real people. And so I kind of am like, oh, right. But sometimes we actually know they were a real person. And then I get excited by that because it's a bit more of a rarity in terms of what I look at. Like, you know, the idea of oral storytelling tradition versus somebody sitting down to write something is so excitingly different that it just provides like a whole other world of speculation on my end.
Yeah, and I think the poetic voice in the Metamorphoses is so strong, really, and the narrator, you know, as I say, pops up so often, and you sense his presence there, that it's really, you know, you really want to establish what that person is, you know, what that person is like, really, I think. But I think ultimately it's just unknowable, really. You know, for instance, that I talked earlier about that episode with Pythagoras. I mean, if you look at the scholarship on that, you've got everything there. I mean, there are people who think that's a serious meditation on, you know, philosophy that provides a sort of important structural basis for the poem as a whole. You've got others who think that Pythagoras is a caricature, that this is a parody, that he's not serious. You have had in the past plenty of critics who said that Ovid was incapable of being serious. It was just not in his nature. You know, so you've got the whole range there, really. And so as someone who then looks at that passage maybe for the first time and you've got this scholarship there, you think, well, I'm not really sure what to make of this, really. And in the end, the only strategy that I think works sort of moving forwards is to think, well, you know, there's the reader has the freedom to make what they want out of it, really. And they can, and if they can make their argument with sort of evidence and so on and so forth, then that's fine. Because it's extraordinary the different range, the broad range of interpretations that you can have for just any one episode in this poem. I think that's and I think that's because there's enough space for that to happen, really. I think it's such an extraordinary thing, you know, that's why people like you and I, you know, in the 21st century are still wanting to read it, I think.
I mean, there's everything in it. You know, I think that, yeah, every theory of Ovid is valid in some way in this work, because there are times when he's silly, when it seems tongue-in-cheek, when maybe it's satirical, and then there's other times where he is incredibly serious and he's really interested in the experiences of these mythological people and what it would have been like to actually, you know, go through some of these things. And yeah, I think that you can kind of pull anything and everything from this work in that way, and that is exactly what you say. Like it's what makes it so interesting. It's kind of a running joke on my show, because I focus on Greek, that Ovid is kind of like the only person I care about in Roman literature, and I know I should be better about that, but it works well as a joke anyway, and he's a good fit for it.
Exactly. And I think actually when you feel that he's being at his most playful, his most jokey, I think that's actually sometimes when he's being the most serious. So he'll slip in. So I think a really important figure in the Metamorphoses is the figure of Asclepius. And because it's a figure that sort of runs through the Metamorphoses, and it also runs into the Fasti, and it's a really important thread that binds those two poems together, the lifespan of this individual. And yet he introduces the birth of Asclepius through a story told by an animal, by a crow, I think. And so, you know, it feels like, you know, the internal narrator of the story, sort of devalues that story. It's just something that's just thrown in there as a diversion. But in fact, it's introducing something that will go on to have a real importance, I think. I'm now thinking that I can't remember whether it was a crow or a raven.
I was going to say, I'm pretty sure it's a raven, because that's a symbol of Apollo, and that's the connection to Asclepius.
I think it was, yeah. I think it was a conversation between a crow. Do you want me to say that again, or shall I
No, don't worry. We can even keep this in. It's like, just we're realizing that it's a raven. But yeah, you're right. I think it's a crow talking to a raven, but the raven is the one that's associated with Apollo. I think my listeners
Yes,
enjoy
it's the
things like this
conversation
too.
between a crow and a raven, and the birth of Asclepius is introduced in that story. There you go. That's pretty.
Well, and it comes from it is a conversation between birds, but and I don't fully recall how Ovid treats it, but it is also like an inherently tragic story because Asclepius's mother, Coronis, is killed or no, she's not transformed, I don't think. She is killed and Apollo births their child from her death. And then there's birds telling the story. So I think that there are like a lot of layers going on in here of what is inherently comedic and then what is like also inherently traumatic in an interesting way.
Absolutely. It's a synthesis of all of that, and then so when you read it, you sort of it can be difficult to unpick all of those different emotions because they don't seem to sit well with each other.
But that's almost what makes it thrilling and interesting to read. It's sort of questioning everything that is going on and the intention behind it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think going back to the subject of this discussion, sort of, which is time, I think sort of the difficulties that exist in the poem to sort of try and understand the way time works in the poem and the relationship it has with space and why these episodes sort of don't seem to fit together in a really satisfying way. It is reflective of a general those general issues that we've just talked about the sort of the differences in tone, the shifts in tone. It's sort of all the same sort of process that you're never quite sure where you are. The poem is so changeable. It's so aware that it's subject its change, that every aspect of it you're constantly having to sort of re-establish your own foundations, if you see what I mean. Make it reinterpret your expectations because they're always shifting in a sense.
Are there any other moments of time playing a role in Metamorphoses that really stand out to you or that just are interesting to share here?
I think the other thing that's really difficult with the poem is establishing. There are lots of references to contemporary Rome that are littered around the poem, and I think, and it's amazing how many there are, or how many have been identified. Let's put it that way. There's the obvious ones with the sort of Romanization of Olympus, and yet that sort of gives you another sort of layer, really, to the poem, this contemporary aspect to it, because you can sort of see the poem as moving forwards in a way from creation to Ovid's own period. But because of the storytelling, the internal storytelling, because of the role of the poet narrator in the poem, you can almost see it moving in the opposite direction as well. In a sense, it's just a Herculean act of recollection, and you sort of you see it moving in the opposite direction, where you start from the present day and you're just remembering the past. And so there's these two ways of seeing it in terms of sort of the direction of the narrative. So there's two ways of looking at the poem. I mean, because there's so much internal narration, because there's the poet narrator, Ovid himself, is so prominent in the poem. You can sort of look at the poem as moving forwards in time and space from the creation of the world to Ovid's own era, basically. But also, and this comes back to my point about how all these contemporary references, you can look at as a Herculean act of recollection, essentially. So you start in Ovid's own time, and then you're moving back in time to the remote past, for instance. because in book one, when he describes Olympus, he describes it in very contemporary terms. So you're already aware of the contemporary aspect to that poem, if you see what I mean. The sort of Ovid's own era is present in book one, if you see what I mean. And so you can look at it in two ways. You can look at it going forwards, or you can look at it going back through memory. And I think one of the really interesting aspects of the poem is this internal narration, is the remembering stories and recalling the past. When you remember the past, it isn't necessarily a straightforward exercise. It's not like sort of you have instant recollection of exactly what happened. You have to sort of reconstruct it. And sometimes your memory of the past isn't necessarily what happened. It's what you think happened, if you see what I mean. And so the poem is really, really aware of that process. Really aware of that process, that when people tell a story, they're telling their version of the story. An example, for instance, is in book 5 with the Muses, when they sort of recount the daughters of Piraeus. They recount their story that they told in this competition, and it is a completely partial account, basically. Given very little space. Seen from the perspective of the Muses, for instance. It's a very, very partial account. So there's an awareness throughout the poem that when people talk, they're not necessarily giving you exactly what happened.
No, that's really, really interesting. I think that adds so much to the poem, because connecting back to everything I've already said in this episode, but I have rarely, if ever, I realize, actually read through the sections at the end, the contemporary Rome sections, because it's Rome. But I think that adds so much to consider it like that, and really does make this connection to, like you're saying, this like Romanized Olympus, which I've always just kind of considered it more of like, well, he's writing in his culture, and thus it's sort of inherently Romanized. But he is really working with so many explicitly Greek stories that I don't know necessarily, translated over to Rome in the same way. And so thinking about it as memory, as kind of, not explicitly, but looking back into sort of the shared history in that region, and remembering it, but with your own cultural ideas associated with it, it really does add so much to my personal understanding of the poem, but I think, to what Ovid is trying to do with it. I'm sort of just still taking it all in, but I really like that way of thinking about it, that the idea of it being more of a memory being recalled.
I think so. And also, I mean, when you think, not just all those examples of internal narration, just people telling stories, to the point, for instance, where you have a situation where I think Hercules' death is described before his birth, for instance, which, completely throws up any sort of sense of chronology, but it's purely a matter of memory, to be honest, functioning in that way. But I mean, you have that idea of stories being told all the time, but not necessarily sort of through narrators. You have the stories that appear, for instance, on Arachne's tapestry, for example. You have in book 2, when Phaethon arrives at the sort of palace of the sun, his father, you have the doors with the sort of cosmos on them, for instance, and then suddenly you have this artistic representation of book 1, or the creation story in book 1, for instance. And you have Philomela, for instance, another example. She can't speak, but then she sort of tells her story by sort of through embroidery, for instance. And she finds that means of sort of communicating. And so it's just a poem that's constantly aware of that. And it has a really deep understanding that when you access the past, that is a really complicated thing, and it isn't at any point straightforward. It's really it really does hammer that message home, I think.
Yeah. And I think it then accounts also for all the changes he's made to the stories. It really just, I don't know. I'm taking it all in. I really love that idea of it being recollection. I think it adds so much and really does account for so much that is in there.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, it's one of those threads that really makes it relevant for the present day and our present day understanding of memory, and how memory can be fragmented and it can be reconstituted, in all sorts of interesting ways. And so the sort of modern theories, when you look at modern theories of memory, they're really relevant for the Metamorphoses, actually, because the Metamorphoses makes total sense when you apply those theories to the poem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, memories can be faulty. Memories can be wrong. They can be changed, and you don't even know. And that's what it makes me think of the Medusa, where he really does explicitly change a story, and considering that as memory, it really adds something to the story that is being told in that case, and sort of the why that is being remembered versus a more traditional version of her. And yeah, I enjoy
I mean, it just happens all the way through. No, absolutely.
Yeah.
And people can have false memories and
Mhm.
genuinely believe that they experienced that thing, whatever they're remembering.
Exactly.
That is a phenomenon that has been shown to exist. I mean, but yeah, no, not just Medusa. I'm thinking now, for instance, the way he rewrites the Iliad, for example. His version of the Iliad is, it just captures so many of the themes of the Iliad, and yet is something completely original. And the same with the Aeneid, and Aeneas's journey to Rome. I mean, it's something that's just continuous in across all 15 books of the poem.
I'm thinking of Circe in the Odyssey sections. She is a completely different Circe. She has all of these weird stories where she's done all these horrible things in a way that is just absolutely doesn't exist in the Odyssey. And these sort of additional, ideas of her that come up in that section. It seems like a lot kind of around those three epics then, which is sort of interesting in itself, recalling these ideas of particularly, the Iliad and the Odyssey, where we've also got recalling these ideas of 700 or 800-year-old oral storytelling and then appearing in Ovid. And what does that do to them when they're being recollected in that kind of way?
No, absolutely, and yet also a profound understanding of those other texts, really, and the themes that drive those other texts.
Yeah, the whole idea is still there, but the details are sort of shifted.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's an incredibly intelligent poem in that respect.
Yeah,
which is goes without saying.
Yeah, we do all love it. Well, so fascinating. I mean, all of it, but now this section at the end, I'm just like, okay, I'm gonna go back to Metamorphoses now with this whole new idea in my head about it, which is perfect because I'm also, like I said, deep in the Metamorphoses at this moment. But thank you so much for sharing all of this.
That's okay. I hope it was. I mean, I do hope it was interesting.
Oh yeah,
and you can cobble together a podcast out of it.
Oh yeah, no
even if I can't remember the details of whether it was a crow or a raven.
I mean, they are two blackbirds that look very similar.
Very similar.
Yeah,
they're very similar. Yeah, no,
I can never tell the difference at
home. Exactly, very difficult to tell apart.
Yeah. Is there anything you'd like to share with my listeners in terms of, where they might read more from you, or I don't know if you have social media that you want to promote or anything like that?
No, I'm a bit hopeless on social media, so no, they can listen to the podcast and then, well, anyway.
nerds, thank you so much for listening as always. I fucking love these conversation episodes, and not only because I get to just like nerd out with people who know supremely niche things about my favorite topics and people, but also because you enormous nerds love it too, and it is so ridiculously rewarding knowing that all of you, like regardless of your knowledge of the ancient world or whether you're remotely interested in learning about it at any formal level, you all appreciate listening to academics share their niche as all fuck knowledge. It's seriously cool, and it fills me with a joy that I just can never fully express, so thank you. This episode was so fun. Give me literally anything Ovid at any time, and I will be happy. So a huge thank you to Freddie for joining me to talk about this and to share so many insights from Ovid and time. I mean, I would have never thought to talk about time as a concept within this text or beyond, because usually it's like, haha, don't go there. But here it is so fascinating and weird. It is a really unique work, this Metamorphoses, in that, and like, I don't talk about this enough because I mostly care about the myths, but it does not only span so many retellings of traditional Greek myths, but it also goes straight into real Roman history, like all the way to the very real Julius Caesar. We will get there eventually, even if it's just in the reading episodes that I've been doing, but it's just supremely interesting and weird, and thus, like, has this extra relevancy when it comes to time. So thank you, Ovid and Freddie. Let's Talk About Myths Baby is written and produced by me, Liv Albert. Michaela Smith is the Hermes to my Olympians and handles so many podcast-related things, from running the YouTube to creating promotional images and videos to editing and research. God, it's everything. Stephanie Foley works to transcribe the podcast for YouTube captions and accessibility. The podcast is hosted and monetized by iHeartMedia. Help me continue bringing you the world of Greek mythology and the ancient Mediterranean by becoming a patron, where you'll get bonus episodes and more. Visit patreon.com/mythsbaby or click the link in this episode's description. Thank you all so much as always. You're cool. I am Liv, and I love this shit.